Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm happy to bring the conversation I had with Geoffrey Wawro. Geoffrey is Distinguished Research Professor of Military History and Founding Director of the Military History Center at the University of North Texas. He's previously served as Professor of Strategy and Policy and Strategic Studies at the U.S. Naval War College. He's also been a Fullbright Scholar in Vienna. He has his Bachelors from Brown University, his MPhil and PhD from Yale University, and he's the author of several books, including the most recent, The Vietnam War, A Military History. I've been wanting to talk about the Vietnam War for quite some time, just kind of do a full, start to finish, all the details. And Geoffrey's book was wonderful, and it was the perfect alignment here. We start by talking about why the United States chose to get involved in Vietnam. Obviously, there's been much that has been said and much has been written about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So we talked about why that was the case. There's obviously a long history. It's about 10 or so years that we were in Vietnam. But it's kind of some history before that, all the way going back to Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. So we talked a little bit about Eisenhower's approach. We talked about JFK's approach, and then some of the attempted coups in Vietnam. We talk about the domino theory, which is such a prevalent theory when people talk about Vietnam, and how much did people really believe that. Talk about McNamara, of course. We talk about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam in 1964, 1965, which is really when it kind of ramps up. We talk about the draft, the high casualties of 1967, 1968. So really brutal years. Public sentiment. Lyndon Johnson not running for re-election, in all likelihood because of how public sentiment had turned about the war. Nixon's approach, which Geoffrey has some really novel and interesting ideas. A lot of times we don't hear about Nixon's approach to Vietnam, and his commentary here was really, really superb. We talk about the legacy of the Vietnam War and many other topics. This was, war is sort of hard to talk about in some ways, right? It's obviously awful, and we don't. It's not good to kill other people on a big scale like this. And the Vietnam War has so much baggage. But I'll say Geoffrey has the book is well written, but in the conversation, it just felt very conversational, and really able to kind of navigate through a lot of the big periods and the big players. And so it was really, really an engaging conversation on my end. He was a real delight to have. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So get over there, like, subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Geoffrey Wawro. I am here with Geoffrey Wawro. Geoffrey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's nice to have you.
Hi, Xavier. Good to be here.
Yes. I'm really excited to talk to you. You've written a masterful book. It's called The Vietnam War, A Military History. It's a big one. I think this clocks in at 600 pages. So, there's a lot to be said about the Vietnam War. I wouldn't expect anything. I don't want to read the 150 pager. Right? The 600 pages is about right. That sounds good for it. So we'll get all into it. Before we do, just tell listeners kind of who you are professionally, academically, or otherwise, and what you're currently up to.
Well, I'm a professor of history at the University of North Texas, which is in a town about 30 miles north of Dallas called Denton. And I direct the Military History Center there. This is my 7th book. I've written, my other books have been on European military history and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. My last book was called Sons of Freedom. It was about the American war effort in World War I, which I published in 2018 on the 100th anniversary of when we got involved and fought on the Western Front. And so anyway, I was drawn to this war because, I grew up in the 60s, so I was a really little kid. But I'm the youngest of 7. I had older brothers who were all subject to the draft and were always freaking out about their draft number and stuff. And I just remember it being, hearing about the war all the time on the evening news, but also, your parents would have a cocktail party and everybody at the party would be talking about it. There were partisans of, Lyndon Johnson, Barry Goldwater, Hubert Humphrey, Richard Nixon, George Wallace, you name it. It's like everybody had a view on the war and how to terminate the war and how to win the war, and everybody had an attitude about the youth culture and the anti-war movement, and so I sort of absorbed it a lot, and then I worked for many years at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and one of the things I did there was teach the Vietnam War case study, and I saw how polarized the literature on the war was, and there was sort of an orthodox view that the war was totally unwinnable from before the first shot was even fired, and there was a revisionist view that the war could easily have been won if only we had really applied ourselves and fought the war without limits, and so I wanted to kind of revisit the war and write a military history of the war that kind of put those arguments aside and just kind of looked at what was possible, from the perspective of the decision makers, political and military. Like what resources did they have? What resources did they need optimally? Did they ask for them? Did they get them? What did they do with them? What effects did that have? How did the enemy hold up? How did the enemy react? And how did the Americans adjust as the war ground on? And how this war that they initially thought would be relatively easy, given the disparity between American wealth and might and North Vietnamese national income and military strength, they thought this war would be easy, and that small increments of American power would quickly persuade the North Vietnamese to just stop fighting. And when that doesn't happen, well, then what do the Americans do next? How do they kind of revise their strategy in view of events? And so that's how the book is shaped, and the book is very deliberately looks at the war as a whole. Most accounts will take you up to the Tet Offensive in 1968 and say, well, that just proved that the war was unwinnable, and then they'll have like one or two chapters just talking about how Nixon winds the war down, Vietnamizes the war, gets out, and then Saigon falls 2 years later. Whereas I see them as very distinct, very distinct but very important halves of this war. The Johnson half and the Nixon half, and I cover the Nixon half as carefully as the Johnson half, because Nixon made all these promises that he was going to win the war and that he was going to win a just and honorable peace and create this free and independent and viable South Vietnam. And of course, he kind of backtracks on all those promises, and he's gotten off very lightly in history. And I think that my history shows just how absolutely cynical the policy of Nixon and Kissinger was, at least as cynical as Johnson's.
That's interesting. You do give it its due in the obviously the back half of the book. So it'll be really interesting to come to that, because I agree with you. A lot of the time, it's Johnson's war. It kind of becomes his war, but as we'll see, it was a lot of U.S. presidents were involved. I mean, obviously Johnson was probably the most, but Nixon also, and so it is nice to see that you kind of tell a bit of that story that kind of gets not as covered as often. So I guess the first thing to start with is kind of a general way here is, why did the United States become involved in Vietnam? You can, and why we stayed there for so long. Now, obviously, if you want a comparison here, of sorts, we stayed longer in Afghanistan, I guess, officially, but Vietnam was a long time. It was a long time we were there, and it was brutal. You talk about how Vietnam was a war of choice. So, tell us just generally about that, and then we can kind of start with some of the origins of how we got involved. But why was Vietnam a war of choice for the U.S.?
Well, I'll tell you how we got involved, and then I'll tell you why it's a war of choice. But how we get involved is, there had been a presidential transition in the midst of the end game of World War II, when FDR dies, right at the end of the war, and he dies in office and is succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman. Now, FDR was always a little bit hazy and vague about all of his big strategic plans, and he was this way deliberately because he didn't want his hands tied, and he wanted to maintain maximum freedom of maneuver. And but we do know that FDR was dead set against any kind of restoration of the old European empires around the world. He wanted one result of World War II, of the Allied victory in World War II, to be decolonization. So even the victorious powers Great Britain and France. France wasn't really victorious. They collapsed and then came back at the end and kind of lined up alongside the victorious powers and were treated as one because it made sense to kind of get them back on their feet as a power against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, right? So, but FDR had despised the British Empire, despised the French Empire, and saw that as part of the United Nations coalition ending World War II, they would decolonize. Well, Truman takes a much more pragmatic, realistic, hard-nosed view of it all and says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So even though I don't like the French Empire, the British Empire, I'm going to allow them to take back these colonies to strengthen them in the Cold War against Soviet communism, right? So that's how the French end up getting back into China, right at the beginning, 1945. The war is over, the Japanese surrender, and the French come filing back in to take up their old position in French Indochina. Well, the Vietnamese had seen the French defeated in 1940-41 and seen the French humiliated by the Japanese in the years after. So they don't really fear the French like they used to. And so they, Ho Chi Minh, and then, he launched, he basically says, I'm the real president of Vietnam, and he has this big rally in Hanoi, and then the French kind of go up into the north, and they take him on, and he has to go into his wilderness area and start the guerrilla campaign against this restoration of the French Empire. And so then they eventually get chased out in 1954 after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And at this point, President, by now Truman has basically been chased from office because of the Korean War, 1950 to 53. And now Eisenhower is president. And Eisenhower is faced with the same choice that Truman had been faced with. Do I step in and try to change the facts on the ground in Indochina, or do I let these indigenous movements have their way? And he, like Truman, says, no, Ho Chi Minh's a communist. Even though there's no Southern Vietnam, movement that has anything like the legitimacy or the power of the Viet Minh movement led by Ho Chi Minh in the North, we're going to try to set one up. We're going to use American resources to create a Southern nation that will be kind of a redoubt of democracy and capitalism and liberalism and stand against this, communist state in the North. So that's when the U.S. really starts pouring in aid. In Eisenhower's presidency, he puts $1 billion of aid into South Vietnam, and $1 billion in those 1950s dollars, right? That's a lot of money. And he stands up a South Vietnamese army and a South Vietnamese bureaucracy and the whole, a lot of economic aid, and tries to kind of fan this country into life. But the problem is it never really makes it because it has a real legitimacy crisis. The first thing, the French leave behind an old emperor, a puppet emperor. And first we kind of govern through him, and then he gets overthrown by his prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, who then becomes our guy in Saigon. And he's going to be there from 1954 until 1963 when the Kennedy administration helps remove him in a coup, right? But the point is that he never really fits with Eisenhower either. Eisenhower doesn't like the guy. He bases himself on a small minority of the South Vietnamese population, the Roman Catholics. He's very tyrannical. He has his brother and his other siblings involved in all the various levels of the South Vietnamese state. So there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of kleptocracy. There's a lot of skullduggery as the brothers try to root out any possible opposition to their brother, right? So we're constantly not liking this guy. But he's not making it, and then we foster a coup in 1963, and we bring in a junta of generals, thinking, well, these younger generals will be cleaner, more nationalistic, more focused on making a good South Vietnamese state, so we'll back them, and so then we get involved with them, and then they keep losing, just as Diem had kept losing, just as Bao Dai had kept losing. So now we're like, well, what do we do? And then Kennedy's assassinated right after the coup that he incited against Diem. He's assassinated in Dallas. So then LBJ takes over, and LBJ says, I'm not going to lose this war because I'll be the first American president to lose a war, and I'll look like I'm soft on communism. So I've got to send troops. Kennedy had always said no troops, no troops. Once we get troops in there, the mission just gets really inflated and big, and then we can't get out because we'll have put too much American capital at stake there. So we've got to keep this as advisory only. Johnson goes, no, I'm going to put troops in and just win this thing. But why is it a war of choice? Because as you can see from that quick resume, we didn't have to go in. We had a choice at every step of the way. We could have accepted Ho Chi Minh, who reached out to us in 1945, but we were too fearful that he was a pawn of Stalin. And then after Dien Bien Phu, we're frightened because China has gone communist under Mao Zedong in 1949. North Korea has launched a war of aggression against South Korea in 1950. That war drags into 1953, the U.S. in a stalemate against the forces of North Korea and China. So when this thing blows up in Vietnam, the U.S. feels like, okay, well, we got to hold the line here. We can't let the communists keep winning, keep pushing us around. But there's no reason we have to do it. Eisenhower famously has the domino theory. If you knock over one domino in Southeast Asia, if you knock over Vietnam, then Laos goes, then Cambodia goes, then Malaya goes, then Philippines go, then Thailand goes. No, that wasn't necessarily true. And then and the other thing is, it's like Lyndon Johnson goes out as Kennedy's vice president in 1961 and does a tour of Vietnam, and he comes back and he says, he says in a speech, we need to hold the line in Vietnam. Otherwise, the communists are going to be landing on the beaches of Waikiki, right? And that wasn't going to happen either. There's no way that the troops of North Vietnam or communist China were going to be landing on the beaches of Waikiki if we did not put troops into Vietnam. So it was a war of choice. And why do we do it? The book argues we did it because each one of these presidents was afraid not of communism, but afraid of appearing weak in the face of communism. So they were posturing. And they could posture, in an advisory role relatively safely because it put few Americans at risk. But once Johnson puts ground troops in and puts a vastly expanded Air Force in, then, lots of American lives are suddenly at risk. And then as they get kind of dragged into this machine of war, more and more troops have to be put in to escalate the conflict and satisfy the demands of the ground command.
Hey, you give the overview really nicely because it does, you can kind of see here that it is a war of choice, and it does, as I said, kind of sort of become LBJ's war. But let me go back to Eisenhower for a minute. He he was a four star general, excuse me. And he was, one of the best. People looked up to him. He had a great time as president, great administrator, very, very, very smart. He infamously had the whole last speech or whatever on the military industrial complex. Like, he knew what was going on here. Why do you think he gave that $1 billion for the expansion of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN? He didn't want to send troops there. He didn't want to get us in there. But what did he feel like throwing money essentially at the problem, at the situation was going to do? Did he feel like it would just kind of offset this and just say, okay, if we just kind of fund them, they'll have some money, they can handle it, and it will go away? Like, what was his, or he just didn't have a big kind of plan?
He's deathly afraid. He's afraid of the same thing that Johnson and Kennedy were afraid of. He's afraid of appearing weak. Why? Because when Eisenhower is president, Joe McCarthy is running these hearings in Congress, and there's House committees like McCarthy's Senate committee doing the same thing in the House, and they're looking for communists in the government. And to be identified as a communist, they don't have to actually have a smoking gun. They just have to show that you are favoring communist interests by not exerting yourself to stop the spread of communism. So if Eisenhower said, you know what, South Vietnam is this corrupt entity that will never stand on its own feet. It's going to inevitably be swallowed up by the more legitimate and popular state of North Vietnam. So let's just get out of the way and save Americans a lot of stress and heartache, right? But no, he couldn't do that because then he would be identified as a philo-communist, somebody who was behind the scenes assisting the rise of international communism, right? So he has to take a hard line. But he's very shrewd. He realizes that if he really goes in too hard and puts too much aid and too much assistance, and he actually puts American troops into South Vietnam, then he's going to be yoked to this very unpopular dictator running South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem. And so he's like, okay, I don't like Diem. I don't think he has a real plan to unify this new country of South Vietnam. But I've got to like make an effort to keep South Vietnam alive as an alternative to the communist rule of North Vietnam. So he puts in enough to what would have been enough to buttress a really young, healthy, ambitious regime that wanted to pull itself together and wanted to fight. But South Vietnam was never like that. South Vietnam was, the North and South had roughly the same population, about 20 million people in each. But South, in North Vietnam, they're very concentrated around Tonkin, this province where Hanoi is the capital, right? And that had been that had always been kind of the solar plexus of Vietnam, where the biggest urban center, that what industry there was all there. What critical raw materials like coal was there, and the richest farms in the Red River Delta were there, and so they were much more cohesive, and they had a real sense of community and nationalism. South Vietnam was totally different. This was a totally artificial country that was put together from this old French colonial province, Cochin China, the area around Saigon, Annam, the area around Hue and Da Nang, different elites, different structures, different mixes of religion, different types of religion. And then you have the Mekong Delta, this big agricultural breadbasket that extends westward from Saigon. And this has like almost all of the economic capacity of South Vietnam, because South Vietnam is agricultural, North Vietnam is more industrial. And so all of the rice growing and the big plantations and everything and the rubber trees, they're densest in the Mekong Delta. And it feeds South Vietnam. But that area was like nobody could really control that area because it's so watery, and canals and rivers and streams. And so it's very hard to kind of defend that vital space, right? So South Vietnam has all of these challenges that North Vietnam doesn't, right? And so in this pending struggle, the North is going to hold all the cards, militarily, politically. And so all these American presidents are just saying, what can I do with this big in a poke? How can I make this country viable? And that's what the whole American experience in Vietnam is, trying to kind of pull this country up by the bootstraps and make it stand and fight by itself, with all of this American aid in the background. And yet it never does. And again, because it's so internally torn by all of these divisions between Catholics, between Buddhists, between peasants, between townspeople, and there's just so many differences between the two societies.
Mm. That's interesting because, Eisenhower was such a respected, general and president and well-loved. And it's interesting to see his fear of sorts and not wanting to get there. You get, someone new in there in Kennedy, and kind of the same thing. Now, granted, it might be a little bit more complicated with Kennedy, I guess, because you had the Bay of Pigs, you had the whole thing with Cuba. Was that sort of in his mind, much, what was the conversation I had with Fred Lagavall? I talked about JFK with him. He had a great book out.
He and I went to grad school together.
Oh yeah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. Apparently, I read somewhere that he was supposed to do a two-parter of JFK, which is now what I hear turned into 3 parts. Which is interesting. That second volume must have got pretty big. But yeah, he said, a lot of people don't realize that, yeah, JFK was young, but he also was extremely well traveled, and saw a lot of stuff during World War II, with his dad being his dad was something in
the ambassador in
right?
London.
Yeah.
UK.
And so he was, he was from a privileged background. He saw a lot of the world. He was kind of up close there with stuff going on in World War II. Like he definitely had some kind of experience in those rooms, kind of about. But anyways, all that to say, Kennedy had some short-lived presidency, of course, unfortunately. He had some stumbles on foreign affairs. What was the fear for him a little bit more because of that, or was it still the same problem with Vietnam? We don't want to send troops there. We don't want to get involved. Let's just kind of offset this. What was the fear, I guess, on his end for Kennedy?
Well, Xavier, you're right to point out how Kennedy was, he was a qualitatively different mind than either Truman or Eisenhower. He was very bookish in his own way, scholarly almost. He was witty and he had a light touch, but he thought deeply about things, and he, the others did too, but in a different way. Kennedy had sort of a scholar's bent, I think, when it came to looking at problems, and he right away identified the weakness of South Vietnam. When Eisenhower was president, Kennedy is a senator from Massachusetts. He visits Vietnam and he comes back and he says, this Viet Minh movement, the Viet Minh movement, which will be renamed the Viet Cong by the Diem regime, it's the same movement. It's this guerrilla movement that drove the French out and will eventually drive the Americans out. He says this Viet Minh movement is, it's everywhere and yet it's nowhere at the same time. It's an enemy of the people. It's defined as an enemy of the people by the South Vietnamese government, but the South Vietnamese people love it, love this enemy. And he says, I don't see how we could ever win such a war, right? So Kennedy already has a great deal of skepticism. When he becomes president, his skepticism has been confirmed by the floundering performance of this South Vietnamese regime in the meantime, right? And yet he has the same impulse as Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. He says, I've got to hold the line in South Vietnam until the elections of 1964. He knows he'll be running against someone like Richard Nixon or Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan, all hawks, all saying stuff like, I don't know why it would take so long to beat this raggedy-ass, fourth-rate little country, North Vietnam. We ought to just go in and get it over. That Reagan says that. Mm-hmm. And Goldwater's saying similar things, as is Nixon. And Nixon says, in 1964 and then 1968, if this war is not over with, then that's going to be the biggest issue in those elections is going to be Vietnam, right? So the Republicans are already running on this issue, saying the Democrats are weak, they can't win this war, they can't stand up to communism, we will. So Kennedy says, I can't just say, wash my hands of this. I need to take it seriously and put in more aid, put in more advisors, and really hold the line. We might not win, but at least make sure we don't lose before 1964. In 1964, he plans to explore all options, including getting out, right? But so he's just, again, war of choice and also war of political calculation. It serves him to keep the war going, to show that he is not a patsy. Because remember, Kennedy comes into office and right away embarrasses himself at the Bay of Pigs, right? Yeah. Then he has a meeting with Khrushchev, gets embarrassed by Khrushchev because he looks callow. So he's determined to show that he has real starch and he can stand up to the communists. So this is an area he can do it in. But he's never deceived. He never thinks that this is a winning hand. He just thinks, I got to get through to the election, and then when I get my second term, I can then spend that second term getting out of Vietnam or Vietnamizing the war, whatever formula he was going to choose. Whereas when Johnson comes in, he looks at it entirely differently and says, no, that's way too subtle. Let's just go in and win.
It's so interesting. It reminds me a little bit of sorts of this idea of, I mean, totally different, obviously, times and everything like that. But I remember, Obama not wanting to get involved in Syria. And it was just you know what? Let's not do that. Let's not do that. We're still in two other places. We had our misadventures in Libya. Let's.
and remember, Obama said, okay, if you guys really, because he was getting the same kind of pushback from hawks. Mm-hmm. And, Obama's weak and he won't enforce his red lines. And Obama said, okay, why doesn't Congress declare war on Syria? And then I'll do something. Right.
And all of a sudden, there's right. That's right. That's a very, very complicated issue. And as we see very sadly today, 13 years later, they're still in conflict there. It's really tough over there. So there's these, you mentioned it earlier, there's these two coups that happen in Vietnam. And I think it's November 63 and February 64. Is this right? I got this right? So this is right after, I guess, I don't know when it was, but right around Kennedy's assassination and then shortly afterwards. So, you have Johnson in the mix there. So he's kind of thrust into this, of course. Um, yeah, what was the reasoning behind it? And I guess why weren't they, why were they not successful?
You mean the reasoning behind the coups?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, because there's three in quick succession, 1960, 63, 64, 65. And it's kind of musical chairs. It's the same group of officers, and then some get kind of kicked upstairs in each of the successive coups. Some get sent off to exile in Paris, or Bangkok, right? But then the sort of the lower men on the totem pole, then they ascend to be leading figures in this National Military Council, which is which is the authoritarian government of these various juntas. But what's going on is that Kennedy despaired of the Diem regime because they start right before the coup, you have these monks, these Buddhist monks in Saigon, Hue, other cities in South Vietnam who begin burning themselves. Right? They douse themselves in kerosene, light themselves on fire at busy intersections. Always in a public area where people are just like horrified. And then and by now you've got a lot of press and television reporters with cameras trained on these burning monks, right? And Kennedy, as America's first Roman Catholic president, always he feels a special responsibility because Diem is basing himself on the Roman Catholic minority of South Vietnam, which had been implanted by the French, right? And most of South Vietnam is Buddhist or other religions, and so Kennedy's like, not only is Diem behaving dictatorially, and it's not just that monks are burning them, it's because he has all these sort of anti-sedition laws, and he's rounding people up, he's throwing people in prison camps, he's having all these rough interrogations, he's going into classrooms, pulling students out because they were at political protests, that sort of, beating them, torturing them, that sort of thing. And he's closing down the press, and he put his brother, New, in charge of the secret police. And the secret police are everywhere, so anywhere you go, any conversation you have is probably being monitored by the Diem regime. So it's this complete dictatorship, and it's based on this Roman Catholic minority. And Kennedy feels very responsible. So he finds that he's lost all leverage over this guy. Despite all the aid we're giving, this guy knows that America, because of its sunk costs in South Vietnam, has nowhere else to turn. He doesn't believe they'll do anything against him because there's no really legitimate leader in South Vietnam, but of the ones there are, he's the most legitimate. I mean, the thing about Diem is he was relatively incorruptible. There's a lot of corruption around him, but he was this sort of puritanical figure. He was celibate. He went to all state functions with his brother's wife as his plus one, because he was keeping himself pure so he could focus on the job. He didn't drink. He was but he was humorless. He was a workaholic, but he talked too much. The U.S. ambassador would call on him, and he would just ramble on for literally hours at a time. So there was no way for American policy to turn this guy and to make him do the things that the United States wanted him to do to make himself more popular, not only in South Vietnam, but across all Vietnam, right? So he could lead this anti-communist movement. So some people around Kennedy, his cabinet is really split. There are, people like, Bob McNamara and Dean Rusk, McNamara Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor. These guys, Lyndon Johnson, Vice President, they want us, they're like, let's all the way with Diem, because we're in this far. If we change horses in midstream, it's just all going to fall apart. But then there's a lot of younger people in the cabinet and in senior jobs at the State Department and the Pentagon. We're saying, no, this guy's we've tried it. We tried everything with this guy. We're not making any headway. Let's back a coup of these young officers that know what needs to be done, and they're going to inject dynamism into the situation. So that's what happened. And the guy who leads the coup that removes Diem just before Kennedy's assassination in the fall of 1963 is, Big Min. He's called Big Min because he's 6 foot, 200 pounds, which is enormous for a Vietnamese. And but he's like he's a tennis player, and he grows orchids, and he's really lazy. He doesn't really do it. So I'm like, wait, this was the guy who was supposed to energize the movement, and so getting his orchids and playing tennis all day, and nothing changes. Things actually get worse. The Viet Cong out in the countryside overrun more villages and more hamlets and take more of South Vietnam under their control. So as bad as things seemed under Diem, they get worse under the first coup government. So then another coup government comes in immediately after it. And then this guy, General Khan, he says, okay, I'm going to the problem with this last coup is they weren't determined enough. I'm going to go all the way and I'm going to fight this war. I'm going to crush the Viet Cong and win. And within a few months, he's arguing for neutralism. He's saying, you know what, we're never going to win. Let's neutralize South Vietnam, having sort of an all-party and then the Americans no, we didn't get involved in this to neutralize South Vietnam. That's what they did with Laos next door in the early 60s. And within months, Laos was overrun by communist guerrillas, right, who took advantage of this neutralization to basically assert communist control, de facto control of Laos. So the same thing was going to happen if you neutralize South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese would just take it over, but in stages, right? So then the United States said, so then another coup arises. And this is the guys that will stay in power till the end of the war, till 1975. And that's, Nguyen Van Tu and Nguyen Cao Ky, as president and premier of South Vietnam. And these are the sort of younger, more dynamic officers, and yet they are just come festooned with corruption, right? Because the way that they kind of embed themselves in this new state is they redirect American aid money to their cronies, and they put all their cronies in charge of all the provinces and districts and counties around South Vietnam, to say nothing of the ministries and the Joint General Staff and the Corps and the divisions, all staffed with with hangers-on of one or the other of these two officers, right? And so and none of these people are particularly competent, right? So it turns out that the coup against Diem was really a bad idea, because none of the groups they bring in the successive juntas are any better. In fact, they're arguably worse.
So I guess it's becoming clear here as you're explaining it. If you're Lyndon Johnson, who I think is a genius, at the very least domestically. I know he gets a lot of shit for Vietnam, and maybe rightfully so. But here at home, he did a lot of good stuff. He did a lot of good stuff for us, and so, but you can kind of see at least how you're framing it here. If you're Johnson, and he's been around for a while. He was majority leader in the Senate for 12 years, and he vice president, and he knew his way about things. He's like, listen, we're not going to lose this. You know what? Let's just rip the Band-Aid off. Let's just get over there. We'll whip them up, and let's clean this up so it's not keeps going for administration. And I guess how much? I mean, I've heard this a bunch and things like that. I mean, how much did people really believe inside the administration, the so-called insider, war elites, or the public even still, about this domino theory? Was that something? It gets talked about a lot, but was it so convincing that people really believed it? And they're like, yes. All of Asia is going to be completely communist, and then it's going to sweep into, to Europe. And it was already, here in Cuba with Castro. I mean, was that a really convincing argument? Were there other arguments? How convincing was that at the time that people really believe this is good enough to say, let's send troops over there?
Well, I mean, it wasn't so much the domino theory by then. That the domino theory, by the 1960s, you have a Kennedy cabinet which is inherited by LBJ. LBJ changes nothing. As he says, "This I'm going to honor Kennedy's legacy by keeping his administration together, and we're going to go forward and get his agenda done." Right, and so that administration, domino theory, someone like Secretary of State Dean Rusk, he's very much of the domino theory school, that, just a reflexive anti-communist, that we have to contain the spread of communism wherever it tries to kind of break out, right? So he's very much in that domino theory vein. Whereas someone like Robert McNamara, who is the Secretary of Defense that Kennedy brings in from the Ford Motor Company, and sort of brings these management methods to the business of running the Defense Department, right? And then applies them to the business of waging war. To someone like him, or to the National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, usually referred to as Mac Bundy. Mac Bundy, the youngest dean in Harvard history, so he comes to administration, in his 40s, and he and McNamara have a much more they're not worried about the domino theory per se. They say, look, I mean, this war won't be easy, but it should be easy because it's the only war we've got going on right now, and we are so rich. We spend $50 billion a year on defense, which was a titanic amount of money in 1962, say.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So we spend $50 billion a year on defense. The U.S. accounts for 40% of world GDP compared to like 15% today. It's like we can win this war just by we just have to choose the right amount of force it will take to crush or intimidate this little third-rate peasant country, North Vietnam, and they'll quit. We don't have to invade them. They don't want to invade North Vietnam because they don't want to trigger a Korean War scenario where China will come over the border to ally with friendly North Vietnam and help throw the United States out of North Vietnam. But they say, look, we can bomb. And they don't want to bomb near the Chinese border where a lot of the munitions and other supplies come across from communist China. So they don't want to bomb those railways because that might bring in China. They don't want to mine Haiphong Harbor, which is the lungs of Tonkin, the port that supplies Hanoi and the Red River Delta. They don't want to mine that or bomb that. Why? Because there's a lot of Soviet freighters that are docking in Haiphong, delivering supplies to North Vietnam. They don't want to hit any of these Soviet ships, kill Soviet sailors, sink Soviet ships. That might bring them into the war.
Mm-hmm.
But they say, even so, we can punish that country. We can take down their electrical grid. We can blow up all their fuel supplies. We can knock down all their bridges, crater all their roads, right? We can pierce some of their dikes and flood some sections of the country. We can do all kinds of things. And they're just going to be like, you know what? It's not worth it. And they're going to cease their support for the Viet Cong. And that way we'll win. So people like Mac Bundy, I call them in the book, and Bob McNamara, I call them the political scientists in the book, because they treat these councils of war in the White House like a political science seminar. They talk about, well, if we signal this, then Hanoi will do that, right? And if that signal's not sufficient, then we'll strengthen the signal. We'll then throw in this, and then Hanoi should do that. And if they don't do that, the problem was in 1964 and 1965, they play war games in the Pentagon where they actually play all this out, all this political science, and they say they say, okay, well, they have a blue team and a red team, and it's staffed by experts on both sides, country experts but also military experts, and in every case the United States loses, every case, because there's no way to wrestle North Vietnam to the mat unless you invade it, unless you carpet bomb it, unless you flood the whole country, unless you destroy the railways bringing essential supplies from China, and you mine the port where the stuff arrives from the Soviet Union, right? But they won't do that, right? So even in 1964, when they play these two, they're called Sigma 1 and Sigma 2 war games, when they try all different kind of strengths of signaling, more bombing, less bombing, put ground troops in, this and that and the other thing. And they find that in every case, if they put in ground troops, well, then how do the North Vietnamese react to American ground troops? Well, then they reinforce the Viet Cong with North Vietnamese regulars, who they send across the DMZ or down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, these kind of jungle trails through neighboring Laos and Cambodia that then branch into South Vietnam. So they match every American troop deployment with deployments of their own. So there's no way. So already in 1964, when Bob McNamara, Mac Bundy, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when they game this whole thing out, they realize that they can't win. And yet Johnson he's like, no, that can't be right. So he's like, it can't be right. And he's full of contempt for North Vietnam. He keeps, that raggedy ass little fourth grade country. And another funny thing about Johnson, he says like, he's yelling at the CIA director in this period saying, how come I'm not getting any human intelligence out of North Vietnam? Yeah, I thought you people had everywhere. You just got to go down to one of those like, Chinese laundry shops in San Francisco, throw a bottle in the ocean, have it float on over there and say, tell me what's going on in North Vietnam. But he's like literally says this in the White House at a meeting because like he's so frustrated. He thinks America has so much power and it ought to be able to know everything going on in North Vietnam, which buttons to push, and ought to be able to come up with the optimal mix of force to make them submit.
Yes, it does sound a little bit like your U.S. arrogance, a bit of sorts of getting involved. We're big, we're bad, we're powerful, we got a lot of money, we got a lot of surplus. Okay, explain this to me. I've asked this a few other people as well. So,
by the way, on that subject, and I don't want to interrupt you, but that's the same view that Rumsfeld took about going into
Iraq. That's right.
He thought America is so strong, and we don't really need to have a post-war plan because we'll be so strong. We'll just take them out. We'll put in our little exiles. They'll take over the running the country. We'll be greeted as liberated. So, it's the same thing happened again. So it's not that unusual that they were thinking that way. That has been an American reflex for a long time.
Yeah, that's what's extremely frustrating about it is that we don't learn the lessons. It's very frustrating. No, but okay, this is what I'm curious about. Help me out with this. Okay, why? I'm gonna pick on him because he's not my favorite person, but why did Kennedy pick McNamara? This guy is from the Ford Motor Company. What the hell is he doing running defense? Like, and I think I'm right on this. I think he's still the longest serving Secretary of Defense or State. Which one was it? It was Defense, right?
Defense.
Yeah. So, 7 years or whatever it was. Why did he pick that? This guy doesn't know anything about this stuff. Sure, systems, and I know he did the systems analysis and trying to be more administrative and trying to get the flip charts going, and he's got all the data and all this stuff. But and then why would you listen to somebody that doesn't have a strong military background or that is leading certain things? Like maybe somewhat involved, but he's the one running the whole Defense Department. Where the funds go, how they do things. And I can understand Johnson's perspective. Okay, we'll keep him until 64, but then still continue to keep on. I've never understood that, why people listen to him, why he was there, and why people listen to what he had to say with, as far as I know, no military background, no expertise there.
No, he served in the Air Force in World War II.
Okay.
More on the analytical side because, he was a very smart guy, and so he kind of figured out ways to do bomb damage assessments, and computerize them, and kind of figure out, what targets remained to be hit and what targets had already been wiped out, and how effective. So he was very good at that. He was a whiz kid as a young man and as an Air Force officer, but but there had been a tradition of the Pentagon is such a sprawling bureaucracy that Eisenhower chose the CEO of General Motors to run the Pentagon when he was president.
That's true.
So bringing in a guy from something as big and sophisticated as Ford Motor Company was actually a good idea in a way, because you had to try to tame this like massive Pentagon bureaucracy and bring order to it, bring order to the process of prioritization, procurement, promotion, everything. So he seemed like the man, and he had also kind of revamped the Ford Motor Company and introduced computers and thought about new processes of assembly and shaved cost and improved all kinds of processes. So Kennedy hoped that he would take this to the Pentagon. Now, Kennedy and Johnson, they both had a real, they had a real suspicion of the uniformed military, in that they thought that the military was always in it for its own interests, and they would support a president or his secretary of defense only as long as they were getting what they wanted. And then if they didn't get what they wanted because the president was trying to put priorities elsewhere or was trying to shave funds from the budget, or didn't want to get involved in whatever adventure they wanted to get involved in, then they would leak and they would cause him problems on Capitol Hill, in the media, in the public square. And, so they both were determined to have somebody in charge of the Defense Department who would be their representative and would cow and command those generals. And and Bob McNamara was that kind of guy. And you say, well, why would LBJ? I can see why Kennedy might have picked him, but why would LBJ was even more impressed by Bob McNamara than John F. Kennedy? Far more impressed. LBJ would say things like, "Yeah, when that McNamara's in the room, I can hear the computers clicking." He just thought he was the smartest guy there was. And Bob McNamara was smart. And but he took and so one of the he does all sorts of things, but as relates to the Vietnam War, as we get into it, and the general in charge of waging the war in Vietnam, the field commander there is General William Westmoreland, who commands MACV, the advisory command in Vietnam. And Westmoreland's like, I'm gonna measure success by body count, because the rules of the game where you can't go into Laos or Cambodia, where the North Vietnamese have sanctuaries. You can't go into North Vietnam, which is their biggest sanctuary. So you have to fight the war in South Vietnam. So he said, okay, well, then how do I measure if I'm winning? I'll measure it by body count, how many of them I kill. And I know the population of North Vietnam. I know the strength of the armed services. I know how many men become eligible for their draft every year. I know how many men they have in their pool of military-age manpower. So then we can kind of figure out when we hit the crossover point, where we're killing more of them than they can put into units. And so they start coming up with these totally bogus numbers. If he's dead in Vietnamese, he's VC. So everybody that gets killed is VC, even if there's no VC fighters there, it's just civilians, right? Well, so McNamara then challenges that internally, and he computerizes the whole thing. And he has an awesome office of systems analysis run by the whiz kids, these young civilians he brings in to kind of look over the military shoulder and check the honesty of their processes, right? And the accuracy of the facts that they're reporting. And so, and he proves internally that Westmoreland is failing, right? So McNamara is no fool. I show in the book that by 1967, by 1966 even, and certainly by 67, he's by 66, he's saying, I think we're not going to win this war. By 67, he's saying, we are not going to win this war. He lasts until March of 68. He wants to retire in 67, and LBJ, who hates resignation, he feels like a resignation is a personal betrayal. So he forces McNamara, who's literally on the verge of a nervous breakdown, to stay in office until March of 68. And he just enjoys torturing McNamara, who's tumbling toward a nervous breakdown. He's just hollow-faced and ashen because he's been spending years flying, working 12-hour days and flying transatlantic and trans-Pacific flights all the time. And he makes him stay on. But by then, McNamara's like, whenever Westmoreland says we need more troops, McNamara's like, no more troops. We're not going to win this war. So he would actually have wound it up sooner. It's Johnson who keeps going because he can't be the commander in chief of a losing war effort.
That's interesting. Well, it's fair. That's fair. I think that's a fair read of McNamara, and I think that's something that is, again, it's when you're trying to put, who can shoulder some of the burden here. I mean, obviously he can do some of it, but I think it's a large part of it. And it's like, okay, at the end of the day, he's not the president, right? If he can say, look, we're not going to win. I'm telling you this, and I feel this in 66. I feel this definitely in 67. Like, you're not going to win. He can only go so far. So tell us again.
But I will say that McNamara's culpability in all this is mainly is getting us into the war. He's the one who convinced Johnson that it would be easy. That America was so rich and powerful that small slices of American power would suffice to signal to North Vietnam that the game was not worth the candle, that they should just pack it in, and they should agree to two Vietnamese states, one in the north, one in the south, and leave South Vietnam alone. McNamara really authored that idea and sold Johnson on it. And then when he, starting in 66, 67, when he's like, no, it's not going to work, Johnson's pissed. He's like, well, you're telling me it's going to work.
You just sold this to me. You just sold it to me. Now you're telling me, never mind.
Johnson's full. There's all these outbursts. You can hear because you can hear all his tapes and everything. It's like they just tell me. That all I get from the army is bomb, 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 bomb. All this bombing bullshit.
He was so colorful in his language, and he's such a character. He's such a character. My goodness. So. Okay, so you break it up. You tell us about the breakup of Vietnam. So there's these 4 corps. Corps 1 in the north by the demarcation line.
I-Corps. You have, always called I-Corps.
Excuse me, I-Corps. And then what is this? 2 corps?
2 corps, 3 corps, and 4 corps.
Yeah. And
I-Corps is the northern provinces, Hue, Da Nang, Quang Tri City, and then out to the west, Khe Sanh. 2 corps is the biggest, but it's the least populated, and that's the Central Highlands. 3 corps is the region from Saigon west to the Cambodian border. And 4 corps is the region from Saigon southwest through the Mekong Delta, also to the Cambodian border.
So when did we start? When did we send the first wave of troops there? When did we officially? I mean, we've been talking about the run up to it, and maybe we've sent some things. But when was the first big kind of wave where we sent people? Was it after the '64 elections? Was this the Operation Rolling Thunder? We get in there and we were trying to search and destroy.
Right, because. After the 64 elections, the 64 election the campaign is punctuated by Viet Cong bombing of American facilities and BOQ Bachelor Office Quarters in South Vietnam, like the Brink Hotel and other places, and then we have an air base set up in Pleiku for this Operation Rolling Thunder, and then they bomb in Pleiku, and they cut through the wire, and they machine gun the base and kill some Americans there. That's in February 65. But there had been attacks during the election campaign in October, November, December 64. And Johnson had not reacted to those because he consulted with pollsters, and they said, the whole reason people are voting for you and not Goldwater is because they know Goldwater will take this country to war in Vietnam. So if you start sending troops because they blew up some American servicemen in a hotel in Quy Nhon or Saigon or whatever, they're going to think you're Goldwater, right? And they might end up voting for Goldwater, right? So don't do anything. So he listens to pollsters like Lou Harris and doesn't do anything. But then in February 65, safely reelected, he then feels like he has to react when they attack Pleiku and they kill a bunch of Americans. And he says, I can't be seen to be doing nothing when they're killing American boys in their tents, right? So he feels like he has to send troops, but that's it's partly to show this increased American commitment and this American anger about these American casualties, but it's also just necessary because they don't trust the South Vietnamese to guard the airfields where you have these hugely expensive American aircraft and these hugely expensively trained American air crews, right? So they feel like they need U.S. service people to guard these air bases. But then they think that these slugs of manpower they're sending over can then also be used for ground operations. But interestingly, it's 15,000 troops and Marines in the first wave who go to Da Nang, and then they're reinforced by thousands more of Army troops who go into the other big air bases and ports around South Vietnam. But they're viewed by McNamara and Mac Bundy and Dean Rusk as another means of signaling. Okay, well, let's send some of these Marines and Army guys out on combat patrols and make contact with the Viet Cong. And when they see American firepower, that'll be another signal hey, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We could do a lot more. So they still see that they can signal violence and this will cause the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to back down, when in fact they do just what they had been predicted in those war games in 1964. Every time the Americans put something in, they put in more, right? They react to every American escalation with an escalation of their own, because they're not kidding. For them, this is not a war of choice. This is not a limited war, which it is for the United States. This is an unlimited war. This is a war of national unification, right? So they're going to do whatever's necessary.
I don't understand. I mean, you could be as big, bad, and rich and all this stuff as you want as the U.S. or any other big world power, but we saw this with Afghanistan. We saw this with Iraq. Like, we don't live in those terrains. Like, and I think this was just true in Vietnam. Like, all the night missions we did and things like that, and how they had the underground tunnels and all these things. Like, you don't want to mess with that. Like, that's their land, their territory, their country. Like, they know it backwards and forwards more than we do. You can't go down to Georgia and Mississippi, Alabama, and think you're gonna simulate South Vietnam. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's no training you can do that's going to simulate that. I feel it's sort of similar with how we did things in Afghanistan and Iraq. Like, you can't simulate that. Like, maybe elements of it in certain places, or we have allies in certain countries, but you're dealing with folks that are that's their country, and they've been fighting there, and they were fighting the French before that, and all these things. It's just they were right. Like you're saying, this is endless. Like, they'll do it till for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100. Like, I just don't know why we underestimated that. That's what's so baffling.
Well, we did. And then, if you remember, because a lot of people don't remember Vietnam because they either weren't born or they were too young. But most people remember the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you remember this enormous consensus there was in the United States about how it would be easy to defeat Saddam Hussein and liberate Iraq and turn it over to the Iraqi exiles who would bring in a democratic multi-party government, blah, 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 right? There was like consensus. Anybody who dared say that that's not going to work was like driven from office. The guy who's going to be the leader of the Senate after McConnell, John Thune, he won his House seat against Tom Daschle, who was the House minority leader. Right, he was the chief Democrat in the House. He lost re-election to this nobody, John Thune, because John Thune basically said he doesn't support the country. Right, he said that the war in Iraq wouldn't work. He doesn't support the troops. Right, and that was in 2003. Right, that was long after the experience of Vietnam. So my point is it's always been very easy for Americans to underestimate the complexity and difficulty of foreign crises, right? Especially in the developing world, right? And so, basically the view in the United States was, how hard could this be? This is a really poor country. And they say, look, they beat the French, true, but the French are the French, right? They're a great power, but they're not a superpower, right? And their resources are a lot more limited than ours, right? And also they looked at, and this is another parallel between Vietnam and Iraq / Afghanistan, is that Americans assume that their technology would give them leverage that previous combatants like the French in Indochina or the Russians in Afghanistan hadn't had, right? So they look at the air mobile concept in Vietnam and say, this thing is invincible. The Viet Minh were constantly ambushing or just running away from the French or just wasting them with mines and booby traps while the French marched around or drove around looking for them. Well, we're just going to land on top of them like a bolt from the blue in helicopters, surround them. And we're going to pulverize them with artillery from fire bases that we're going to place all around South Vietnam. So every inch of South Vietnam will be within range of a battery of 155 or 105 millimeter howitzers. Literally. You go to Vietnam today, in southern Vietnam, there are fire bases still everywhere with the asphalt helipad, the Claymore mines still sunk in the earth, the traces of the old perimeter fences. They're still there on every hilltop. The whole country was made into basically a helipad / artillery base, right? So everywhere was, so they said, how is the Viet Cong, or if the NVA wants to infiltrate troops in to assist the Viet Cong, how are they going to survive against nonstop accurate artillery fire, against constant airstrikes from tactical aircraft, which were going to be based in 100 American air bases around South Vietnam, and then just air mobile troops from 6 or 7 U.S. infantry divisions that can be like scrambled into a place on a moment's notice on helicopter, right? They said they're not going to get away. They're not going to survive. That's why they have the whole body. We're just going to like slaughter them in a way that they're not used to being slaughtered because they've been fighting against the more leisurely French.
Mm. Well, I guess the other thing is you're saying about sentiment. So the public sentiment in the beginning, Johnson sells Vietnam to Americans, but we get the draft, which is, if I think of a draft today in almost 2025, that just seems unthinkable. No one's doing that. Like there were 27.5 million American males eligible, and almost 2 million get drafted and sent to Vietnam. I mean, how did we do this? Like, what was the legal standing on this? But how did we do this? Was there another way we could do this? Like, how did we get away with doing that with 2 million of people drafted? Almost 2 million people. It seems so like far away now. But like, I mean, I know people that were drafted. I mean, it's crazy. How did we do this?
Well, I mean, it had been, a draft had been in force, since World War II, right? So
right.
People were used to the draft. Everybody, everybody had to register, and people got drafted, and they had to do their little tour, and then they got out. But so this was like, first time since Korea that it was done to send people off to war, right? And so it was controversial, right? But interestingly, what the military wanted to do and what the Secretary of Defense wanted to do was mobilize the reserves, right? There were 1 million reservists, right? These were trained personnel that were on the payroll as weekend warriors, getting whatever benefits reservists got at the time and pay. And they could be called on to not only to flesh out units departing for Vietnam, but also like if you had to pull people from NATO or pull people from Japan or South Korea, to fill up these units, you could put these reservists out into those other, no less important commands. Because remember, during the Vietnam War, all these other areas don't go to sleep. There's still Chinese pressure on the Taiwan Straits. There's still Soviet pressure on Central and Western Europe. There's still communist threats against Japan, right? And there's still constant wars and threats to Israel in the Middle East, all of which have to be backstopped by American, Army, Air Force, and naval units, right? So so the reservists were key to keep all of these other responsibilities up to strength and also to reinforce the mission in Vietnam. But someone like President Johnson, said, and Kennedy before him, because Kennedy had called the reserves once in his short abbreviated presidency because there was a Berlin crisis. And so he called like 150,000 reservists or something to show strength in the face of this Soviet bluster against Berlin. And, it was like, Americans don't like that because suddenly you're taking these guys that have they're grown up, they've got families, they've got jobs, and then you're pulling them in and deploying them and upsetting everything. Whereas, you grab these 20-year-old draftees, and they have no dependents and they're kind of free agents, right? And so it was a lot easier to take the draftees. And the draftees themselves were okay with it because it was, their brothers had done it, they're doing it, their fathers had done it. And, for the first 2 years, 65 to 67, all of the commanding officers spoke glowingly about the performance of drafted American infantry in combat. They were like, these guys are fit, they're disciplined, they don't freak out in combat situations, they do their job, and so everybody was, so the draft actually functioned really well. And then, but as the war drags on and as it becomes clear to the troops that the war is pointless, that the war is endless, that the war is being prolonged, basically for the political fortunes of politicians in Washington or to buy time for these corrupt officials in South Vietnam. Then the troops start saying, they start saying, this war is not worth it. I don't want to be the last guy to die in this losing effort. We're being sacrificed as pawns, right? And so morale really, from 67 on, morale really begins to worsen.
Yeah, so I'm gonna speed us up here into to the Tet Offensive, right? Because that's the beginning of '68. But yeah, you talk about '67 is internally, as you were talking about, McNamara was like, listen, we're not going to win this, and it sounds like sentiment with troops is going down. The public is now kind of doing the anti-war protests. All these 67 is kind of the 67, 68 were some pretty wild years in the U.S. On a lot of ways. In 1967, 100,000 deaths. That's wild. That's so many people. That's just insane. So how in the beginning of '68 we get this Tet Offensive? Can you tell us what this is and what happened and yeah, like how instrumental it was, I guess. And you can talk about mini Tet, a little bit later in the year if you want to. But what was this and why was it instructive?
Yeah, well, because Johnson had been he'd been elected in for his own first term in 1964, and he had assumed that he was going to really take the gloves off to the extent that he could. Again, having to always hedge against Chinese or Soviet intervention, so couldn't really take the gloves off, but he would do what was needed to win the war. But by '67, he's going to be running. He's going to be running again in '68 against a Republican who's going to bring up the same charges that were leveled against him in '64, but will be much more effective this time. And the main Republican accusation is that the Democrats are fighting a no-win war. That they keep putting stuff in, men, materiel, money, and it keeps on just like straggling along with no end in sight, no decision, right? And so we Republicans are going to go in and we're going to win this thing. Right? So this is a very appealing argument to Americans who are tired of this. They're tired of the casualties. They're tired of the expenditures. They're tired of the inflation. You're seeing rising inflation in the United States. The stock market is like sort of puttering along. You're getting a situation where internationally the dollar is plummeting. Foreign governments are dumping their U.S. treasuries and trying to take gold out of the because they don't trust because of America's deficit spending on this Vietnam War. So there's all kind of economic knock-on effects, and then Americans are just tired of the death and destruction. So so Johnson enlists Westmoreland in his political campaign. He brings him back to the United States in late 1967. He becomes like the first field commander in American history to leave his command to go back and politic around the United States. And he goes on the networks and he gives press conferences. And he basically talks up all the progress that's being made in Vietnam. And that's when he says things like, we've turned the corner. There's light at the end of the tunnel. The end is near. We've got them on the run. And he talks about how he's inflicted so many casualties that they can't possibly recover from this kind of a bloodbath. And that one last push is going to win the war, certainly by 1968. And the American people believe this, right? Because Westmoreland has kind of august presence, and he seems like the general from Central Cassidy, from this old South Carolina military family that had been fighting in the U.S. military since the American Revolution, right? And a West Point graduate, the whole thing, and so Americans assume that we're about to win the war, and then in last days of January, first days of February 1968, this Tet Offensive breaks out. This was something that had been cooked up starting in the fall of 1967 in the Politburo in Hanoi. By this point, they are really suffering. They're suffering from the body count. They're suffering from the bombing, Operation Rolling Thunder. It's not like carpet bombing, but it's relentless. They keep knocking down bridges, knocking out roads, knocking out all kinds of infrastructure. And so just life in North Vietnam really sucks. It's you're constantly you don't have power. The food supply is really short, so everybody's on sort of starvation rations. Food is being reserved for the troops in the field to be sent down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. People are eating really just repulsive food that would normally be thrown away. They're gathering slugs and stuff from the garden and throwing that in to have protein. So people they feel like even these people that we have controlled so effectively through these tyrannical communist measures, even they will have a limit. So they're the North Vietnamese are trying to, how do we win this war? And they realize they're never going to beat the United States in the field, but they need to deliver a shock, a demoralizing shock that will convince the American people that the war is unwinnable. It will force the Americans to disengage, de-escalate, and will allow the North Vietnamese to fight alone against the South Vietnamese. And so the plan to do that is the Tet Offensive. And what is it? It's going to be this secret offensive that will launch against 146 South Vietnamese towns and cities, all the provincial capitals and the main cities like Hue, Da Nang, Saigon. They're all going to be hit. Kon Tum, Pleiku. They're all going to be hit at, more or less at the same time by surprise. Like these attacks are not going to be heralded in any way. They're just suddenly going to be hit by some by NVA regulars, others by Viet Cong troops. And it's not it's sort of urban legend that it was a surprise. It was not a surprise. Everybody saw it coming because how do you hide such a thing? There was so much traffic of people, and there were so many signs that Viet Cong guerrillas were massing to attack these provincial capitals. There were signs that Viet Cong infiltrators were coming into Saigon, right? And also just the people that were monitoring the American Corps commanders in those 4 core areas that were monitoring Viet Cong main force and Viet Cong guerrilla movements saw them all moving away from the frontiers and toward those cities in the interior. So they made some tactical adjustments of where they left the U.S. troops and the army, which ended up being providential, because if they hadn't moved those, then the Tet Offensive might have succeeded. But as it was, it ended up being this incredibly violent, bloody couple of weeks as they got into the heart of Saigon. They got into the United States Embassy, and the embassy reacted, and they brought American troops in on helicopters. They landed on the embassy roof. They fought the Viet Cong. They killed them all. They saved the embassy. But this was all on TV. People in the United States saw it. They said, "Wait a minute. Westmoreland was just back here at the National Press Club saying the war was over, and now the Viet Cong are inside the U.S. Embassy, right?" And then they fought this 2-week battle for Hue City, where the Marines lose 1 casualty for every yard of the city they retake from the NVA inside Hue City in the first 2 weeks of February, of 1968. So the point is yes, the Americans and the South Vietnamese army, the ARVN. They throw the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong back during this Tet Offensive. But the casualties are very high, and the humiliation to the United States, who had been telling, to the Johnson administration, who had been telling people that Westmoreland was winning, the Americans were winning, the war, feel good about voting for Johnson in 1968 because we're about to win this war. And then suddenly everything is reset to zero, because now it's like, wait a minute, we're not winning the war. They're in the South Vietnamese cities that were considered totally secure. And in the course of the Tet Offensive, they overrun a lot of the villages that had been secured by the South Vietnamese military, and now they're taken back by the Viet Cong. So they're thrown 100 steps backward by the Tet Offensive. And so now Johnson he no longer has this message that we are winning, we've turned the corner. Now he's in a situation where no, we're clearly not winning, and we've got to rebuild everything that we thought we had built, because it's all been torn down by this Tet Offensive. And this is really what will drive him. In March of 1968, he's going to say, "I will not seek, nor will I accept, the nomination by my party to be your president," because he realizes that there's no way he's going to win this war in time. He's going to be pilloried as the guy who can't win who's fighting the no-win war. So he'd better just spend his last months in office trying to make peace.
Yeah, it's quite wild how it all turns out. So Westmoreland leaves. Johnson doesn't run. He's gone. And so we get Nixon. So I'll give you as much runway here as you want to tell us, because you mentioned at the top about how a lot of people don't talk about Nixon's involvement, what he did. And so we can, criticize Johnson and stuff, but yeah, so tell us, what was Nixon's plan for ending the war? You can talk about Vietnamization, what that was, but even more specifically, how did he start to use, and along with Kissinger, We know enough things, some of the horrible atrocities in Cambodia that happened, and how they came in from Cambodia into Vietnam. Yeah, so obviously there was the drawdown, but yeah, tell us as much as you want. Give you as much runway here, just on Nixon's plans for the war, and then maybe you can kind of juxtapose that for us with how Johnson had done it. So yeah, just tell us Nixon's kind of
Yeah.
strategy.
Well, Nixon's critique of Johnson as a candidate when Nixon's running against Johnson, or he thinks he's running against Johnson, and then Johnson will withdraw in March, and it'll be Humphrey. So his critique of the Johnson-Humphrey ticket on Vietnam is that they're fighting the no-win war, and that Nixon, from day one, will turn it around, and he'll take the gloves off, and he'll fight to win. And he campaigns on a secret plan, and he just reveals it, to different audiences. He says different things. To a more liberal audience, he'll talk about how he wants peace and he's going to get peace. To a more bellicose audience, he'll talk about how he's going to bomb more and he's going to fight harder and go and take key military objectives that Johnson is shrinking from. But basically, the secret plan is that he's going to detach North Vietnam from its two key allies, the Soviet Union and Communist China. He's going to do this in a revolutionary way. He's going to go to China and have the opening of China in 1972 and meet with Mao Zedong. And he's going to agree to the one China policy and to transfer China's UN seat from Taiwan to Beijing, to the communist government in Beijing. So he's going to make all these concessions to communist China in the hope that they will then, attenuate or remove their support for the North Vietnamese regime. He's going to do the same thing in the Soviet Union. He doesn't need to open to them. We already have relations with them. But he's going to meet with Brezhnev, and he's going to offer Brezhnev détente. Say, look, I'll relax the missile race with you and all this tension around the globe if you will relax your support for the communist regime in North Vietnam. And so, for Brezhnev, this will probably be a chip that he doesn't mind trading. He'll allow two states in Vietnam if he can kind of spend less on the missile force against the United States, or have to worry less about American pressure about human rights in Europe or whatever. And same thing for Mao. Mao doesn't necessarily want a big, strong Vietnam on his border. Two little weak Vietnams would probably be better. So he might be okay with this too. So Nixon has this grand sort of diplomatic agenda, but this is all secret. He doesn't say, I'm going to do this, because then it wouldn't be the secret plan. And he can't run as an anti-communist and then say, I'm going to go to Beijing and shake hands with Mao and then go turn over the Taiwanese UN seat to communist China, right? He can't. So this is all very secret. This all emerges after the election. But then militarily, the secret plan is he's going to ramp up bombing. Johnson had done a bombing halt. It ended Rolling Thunder in March of 1968 when he says, I'm going to dedicate myself to peace. He orders a bombing halt. And then by the fall of 1968, he'll extend that to all of North Vietnam. There's a little strip along the DMZ he'd continue to bomb, and then he does away with all of it. Well, Nixon says, I'll start bombing again, And he says, I'm going to invade the sanctuaries. I'm going to go into Cambodia, and I'm going to go into Laos, where North Vietnam, moves on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and where they have sanctuaries where they leave whole divisions and motor parks, and munition supplies, and they just sort of lug them into South Vietnam as needed. So Nixon says, I'm going to wipe out those sanctuaries. And so that's his plan, and that's what he runs on. And he has slogans like, never has so much, diplomatic and military force been and financial and economic support been, offered into a cause and put to so little use than under the Johnson administration. The Nixon administration is going to be much more effective and efficient, and we're going to go in and win. So, how he actually wins the election is interesting, because he interferes in the election. As I said, LBJ had been losing and had been falling behind in polls, But once he says, I'm not going to take the nomination, and he dedicates himself to making peace and offers the bombing halt, he starts moving ahead. He sends Averell Harriman to Paris to lead negotiations on the American side. And by October of 1968, on the eve of the election, they're about to sign a peace deal. And I talk in the book about how the war would have ended in October or November of 1968 with 30,000 American dead. And instead, Nixon sabotages the peace talks using Henry Kissinger as his cutout and deliberately prolongs the war to get elected because he worries about an October surprise. If Johnson announces a peace deal in October or November of 1968 just before the election, Humphrey will surge in the polls, overtake Nixon. So Nixon literally sabotages. He reaches out to Nguyen Van Thieu, the president of South Vietnam, through back channels, guided by Kissinger, and he says, do not go to the Paris peace talks. Do not sign any peace agreement offered by Lyndon Johnson. Wait on Nixon. If I get elected, I'll offer you a better deal. So Nguyen Van Thieu withdraws from the peace talks. So instead of ending in the fall of 68 with 30,000 American dead, the war will drag on for another 4.5 years and end in January of 1973 with 58,000 American dead and hundreds of thousands of American wounded. All because Nixon and Kissinger sabotaged those peace talks. So that's the original sin of his presidency. But then what happens when he gets in? How does his plan, his secret plan, work out?
Right.
Well, he goes to Beijing, and he goes to Moscow, offers détente, offers the opening, makes all the concessions, and they do nothing to help the United States. So he gave away all this stuff, and they still are supplying North Vietnam with the latest and greatest of military technology, constantly upgrading their rockets, their artillery, their tanks, their vehicles, their SAM missiles, their anti-aircraft guns, everything they need to defend against American air raids and American troops on the ground. And then in his efforts to increase the tempo of military operations and inflict more pain on the and more killing on the VC and the NVA. Well, by this stage of the war, after Tet, after 1968, when we're losing 200 American deaths every week, 200 or more American deaths every week, and we're spending $70 million a week in 1968 dollars on this war, a week. And Americans are sick of it. And so you have the whole youth movement, the anti-war movement, and Americans are turning out in record numbers. You have the moratorium marches, and they're saying no more, don't escalate this war, wind this war down. You ran, because Nixon, when he ran, he said, I have a secret plan to end the war, to get us out of there and with a peace with honor. So they're like, you said you were going to end this thing and get us out of there and get us a peace with honor, and instead you're now escalating. Because Nixon had assumed that he would hit them so hard militarily, it wouldn't take long to break their back. But now they just absorbed all the blows he throws at them, the same way they'd absorbed the blows that LBJ threw at them. It was basically, they avoided combat. 90% of American operations in the Vietnam War across both presidencies, LBJ and Nixon, never made contact with the enemy. We were just groping in the dark. They saw us coming with all those fire bases, all those helicopters, they melted away. So, the cost kept rising. The casualties from mines and booby traps and accidents and friendly fire kept rising because of the increased tempo, but we weren't killing more of them, right? We weren't getting them any closer to the peace table. So, and then Nixon says, okay, I'm going to the sanctuaries. So he invades Cambodia in 1970. Oh my God, that's when we had the Kent State shooting. When National Guardsmen at Kent State in Ohio shoot into a crowd of students with live ammunition, kill 4 and wound 7. And then that's followed by shootings by police and National Guardsmen in Mississippi and in New York, right? So, the thing is, it's everywhere he turned, and then the incursion itself made very little impact on the North Vietnamese. And then he authorizes American pilots to fly in support of a South Vietnamese incursion into Laos in 1971. Complete fiasco in every way. And damaging not only in that it doesn't achieve the desired effect, but it revealed the complete fraudulence of Vietnamization. This process of that was another part of Nixon's secret plan, handing the war over to the South Vietnamese by this improvement and modernization program, where we would give them the latest technology, train them in its use, and let them fight the war. Well, that was the army that went into Laos in 1971. Operation Lam Son 719, it was called, and complete debacle. And all these hundreds of American aircraft shot down, supporting this flawed incursion, and dozens of American pilots killed supporting this flawed incursion. And again, for no good result. So Nixon's secret plan was hatched after this incredibly cynical intervention in the war, where he lengthens the war by 4.5 years, doubles the number of American casualties. And the icing on the cake, at the end of this, at the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, after Nixon does all this damage, he gets the exact same peace deal that Averell Harriman was offering in October 1968. That Thieu wouldn't take. Thieu ends up taking that in 1973, after all that expenditure of blood and treasure. So Nixon's war is an absurdity in every way, and it's a crime in that he deliberately prolongs the war with Kissinger to get themselves into office, and then gets nothing for it, and you have to really read a history of the war such as mine that kind of like knits this Nixon war into the overall war effort to just show how futile and pointless it all was, and how it was geared for Nixon's own career prospects, and it served no national security end for the United States.
Yeah, that's quite upsetting to hear. I mean, it really is. So in the end, the war kills 58,000 Americans, 250,000 ARVNs, 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians, 1.4 million NVA and Viet Cong. POWs were there for many years. Obviously, we've been talking about it throughout the conversation, the parallels with Afghanistan and 20 years there. And, the pullout in Vietnam wasn't great. The pullout in Afghanistan wasn't great. At the end of the day, I go back to the first question. War of choice, okay. But what was the point? If you tell a 10-year-old, why did the United States fight in Vietnam from 1964 to 1975 or whatever it is, 10, 11 years? Why did we do all this? Why did the US fight for a decade in Vietnam and got literally nothing for it but death and misery and shame and debt and all these things? Why did we do all this? What was the whole point?
I mean, the arguments that took us into the war, remained, relevant to the very end. So the idea that of the domino theory, for example, John McCain wrote about his experiences as a POW in North Vietnamese jails. He was shot down over Hanoi in 1967, and he was one of the last guys to go home. And but he would be visited in his cell by North Vietnamese, high-ranking officers and officials, because they knew that his father was the CINCPAC commander. He commanded the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Command that oversaw MACV, right? So the guy who oversaw the operations in Vietnam was the CINCPAC commander, and that was McCain's father for part of the war. So people would come in to see him and talk to him, and he was tortured and he was harshly mistreated. But then occasionally they'd come in just out of curiosity to speak with him. He talked about one such where they came in and they were gloating about how, this war is getting, more and more unpopular in the United States, and there's more pressure on Johnson and then Nixon to get out of this war. And, as soon as we win this war, after we take South Vietnam, then we're going to take Laos, then we're going to take Cambodia, then we're going to take, Thailand, then we're going to take Malaya, then we're going to take Singapore, we're going to take it all, right? So he recounts this at one conference with some boastful North Vietnamese officers, right? So there's an argument to be made that by staying there and by grinding down the North, we kind of slowed this agenda, if there was such an agenda. You could argue that is China really going to sit by idly and let North Vietnam take over all these places? They have their own interests, right? So, but the point is like, there was a sense, and right up to the end, that something happened. That if you were going to contain the Soviet Union and communist China, well, then you had to contain them. You couldn't just let them run amok, right? So there was that sense right to the end. And there's people to this day that argue, well, one reason the nations of Southeast Asia are largely free is because the Americans kind of held the line for that critical period and really bled North Vietnam and made it really extremely difficult. But, that's, against that, you have to say, okay, well, how about I can see why we got into the war, and I can see why we got into the war really reluctantly, because we saw the kind of regime that we were going to be allied with. And it's not that it was that much worse than the North Vietnamese regime, because they were no sweethearts either. They were tyrannizing their people through a communist secret police and all kinds of controls on people's behavior and speech and how they could associate with each other, right? So there was nothing good about that regime either, but that regime was popular because they were delivering on the legacy of Ho Chi Minh, because they were like redistributing land, and they were freeing peasants from these old sort of manorial feudal relations under the French, right? So communism had some appeal to these peasants, right? And so what the South Vietnamese regimes were doing is they were just giving land back to the big landholders, right? And they were just taking old French estates and giving them to the rich Vietnamese guys, right? And same thing with industries and plantations in the South. They were just handing them over to cronies of the regime, making no effort to sort of win over the peasantry and or win over all the young students that were coming up and looking for jobs in the bureaucracy and being confronted with this kind of eternal corruption. So, so knowing all that, well, then you'd think more like John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, again, was saying, I will support this regime to get through the next elections, but I'm not putting troops in because this regime's not worth one drop of American blood. I mean, we were losing drops of American blood because a lot of the advisors were being killed, but these were very small numbers, and Kennedy was okay with that. But he's like, I'm not going to put in combat troops and have a lot of American casualties and have a lot of American expenditure in the service of this regime that just frankly will never be able to win, right? So there were people that thought about this. Then once Johnson gets involved, he sees it in very, very simplistic terms, right? Like, there's got to be a way to beat this crummy little country, right? And then so he just keeps adding force. But then it's never enough, right?
Yeah.
And then, when Nixon comes in, he says, Nixon actually, in 1969, he comes up with this plan called Operation Duck Hook, where he's going to literally bomb all of North Vietnam, the railways to the north, Haiphong Harbor. He's going to knock out all the dikes, so he's going to flood the entire country, drowning most of the population, and he's going to use nuclear weapons, right?
Jesus Christ.
So
But
then, what does he do? He tears it up because he realizes there's no way I could do this. If I do this, I'll become like a war criminal. No American will vote for me. I mean, some people will, right? The Wallace voters will vote for me, but nobody else will vote for me. And I'm going to alienate every United States ally around the world, right? Americans have totally by 1969 are totally turned against the war. So it's like he says, okay, I can't do that. So this whole idea that he was going to use more force, he does try that, and he starts working up the ladder, and right away he gets blowback from the American people, from the media, from the students, in the moratorium marches. It's just like average people, like moms and dads and their kids, right? And so it's no longer just the youth counterculture. It's like the mainstream is turning against the war. So he can't put in more force because everybody is just sick to death of the war and wants out.
Yeah. I'll just say it's super important that we continue to know this history because, we obviously there's still people that have fought in the war. They're still alive, obviously, and it's important to know the history. So, Geoffrey, this is much needed. The book is great. You are wonderful at navigating us through a lot of this information. So I really, really appreciate you coming on and telling us all about this history. It's really, really important. So big thanks.
Thank you, Xavier. It was a pleasure talking with you and meeting you, and hope to talk to you again.
Absolutely.